Okay, well, good evening. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is the penultimate lecture of the California Garden and Landscape History Society's 2021 online lecture series. And I believe many of you have attended one or two of our lectures over the past year, but in case not, my name is Eleanor and I sit on the executive board of CGLHS. I work as a landscape historian and I'm based in San Francisco, but tonight I'm here to introduce our speaker. I'd also like to take this moment to encourage you to look at our website and review our membership options if you aren't already a member. CGLHS is a membership-led organization and dues help us provide programs like this. Members benefit from early registration and discounted rates to our programs and are also mailed copies of our quarterly journal, Eden, which I'm holding up, but I realize now my screen is a little bit small, so you may not be able to see it. But you can view copies of it on our website as well. Our speaker tonight is Stephen Keylon. He's a landscape historian based in Palm Springs, and this is actually the second lecture he's presented as part of this series. The first was on landscapes of leisure last fall. Tonight, he'll be talking to us about landscape architect Tommy Tomson, a designer that helped spark Stephen's interest in landscape history. He'll discuss Tomson's decades of work and Tomson's relationship to the film industry, but he'll also describe some of the types of roadblocks landscape historians often run into during our research efforts. I also want to say that Stephen is the editor of Eden, and he's taken the journal just to an entirely new level over the past several years. And receiving this copy, each copy in the mail, is really one of my favorite parts of being a member of the organization. And the last issue looked at the history of orchards across the state, and we'll be announcing some kind of cooperative fall events soon that tie into that theme. So keep your eyes peeled for that announcement. And just final item before we start, I want to say that this lecture is being recorded and that it will extend for approximately 50 minutes, and we'll try and save some time for discussion at the end. But if you have comments or questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat or direct message me, and we'll queue those questions up for Stephen if we have time. All right, let's get started. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. I'm excited to tell you about the big T, Tommy Tomson. I became interested in Tommy, I'm maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I had been doing research on another landscape architect named Fred Barlow Jr. We had moved into a National Historic Landmark community called Baldwin Hills Village that he had designed, but nobody knew anything about him, even though he had been the first national ASLA chair on the West Coast. He died in 1953, left no archives, but there was little information. I finally found his children, and we had, over the years, have become very good friends. During my research, Tommy Tomson's name kept coming up, and so I became intrigued and realized he had laid out the whole city of Palm Desert. So I wrote to their historical society, and they put me in touch with his daughter Duchess, and she came out to, here's Blanca. She decided we would meet. She flew out to LA. She was living in Idaho, and we met at El Cholo Mexican restaurant, and we really hit it off. And so I would either go to Idaho where she was living, or she would come to Palm Desert to stay with her sister Kay. But over the course of many years, I interviewed her probably for 100 hours and have recordings of that. And I would go because she had what was left of Tommy's archives, his professional papers. And so I began taking inventory, and we hoped that they would go to UC Santa Barbara. Ultimately, it became clear she had dementia, so I rented a big car, and my partner and I went up and stayed with her for a week, and she remembered everything about what she wore and ate in 1941, but not so much recent. And so we gathered up what was left of his archive, and just in time, because soon thereafter her son cleared out the house. So there's very little left of so many of these early landscape architects. So these papers will go to UC Santa Barbara. I hope to write a book about Tomson. So let's get into it. So Tommy Tomson was, considered landscape architect of the stars, had a very long career. I hate to read during my lectures, but I'm going to read a little bit of my introduction, which I kind of try to encapsulate some of that spirit of his work. So I'll start reading, but then I'll just talk to you. Much like his high-profile clientele, Tomson himself was dashing and glamorous, overcoming his humble roots by reinventing himself. The outstanding success of his 40-year career was made possible by the fortunate confluence of talent, drive, charisma, and serendipity. Tomson was not formally educated in his field, nor privileged to have taken the then customary grand tour of Europe. Instead, he shaped his exquisite landscape design aesthetic by reinterpreting his love of the romantic past within the context of contemporary and livable landscapes, ones that showcased his scrupulous attention to detail and provided ample opportunities for recreation, socializing, and outdoor living. Tomson helped shape our image of Southern California as a relaxed, seductive, sun-soaked Eden. Imagine a swanky resort swaying Washingtonia robusta palm trees, probably planted in a V pattern, which became his signature, casting deep shadows onto a shimmering swimming pool with an adjacent stylish pool pavilion, and nearby a broad patio with tennis courts in the background, flowering California shrubs and vines. Copa de Oro and scarlet trumpet vine were his favorites. Throughout, and perhaps even a lounging movie star or two. This image didn't really exist until Tomson helped create it in the 1930s. The luxurious landscapes of Tommy Tomson exhibited great taste and style, often with a grand and deliberate theatricality, which, like the Hollywood films of the day, were an escape for those fortunate enough to experience them. Tomson was a master of selling an idealized image of California so that the tourists felt like Lana Turner or Cary Grant when arriving at Union Station South Patio, dining under the olive trees at the Brown Derby on Wilshire, dancing at Ciro's, enjoying the pool at the Beverly Hills Hotel, seeing a radio broadcast at CBS Studios in Hollywood, or enjoying the races at Santa Anita racetrack. All of these projects were some of Tomson's work for the 1930s. He also collaborated with the finest architects working at the time, and they respected each other tremendously. And more times out of than not, the landscape architect that they chose was Tommy Tomson to do their very own homes, as you see here with Welton Beckett's house. Because of his association with Cliff Henderson, his brother-in-law, he also, one of the other themes of his career was doing the homes and even factories of aviation pioneers. Here, there's Cliff May designed home for Cliff Garrett, an aviation executive, and Tommy did the landscape for that. So, you know, people really were enveloped in this feeling of glamour that Tommy was able to infuse these landscapes with. And it's remarkable considering the humble roots that he came from. He was born in Zanesville, Ohio, to William and Emma Tomson. William Tomson was the town's dentist. He was the minister of the church, and he was also a Chautauqua lecturer. They had 3 children. They had Paul and Florence, who they called Irene. And curiously, they named Tommy Golden Sands, which must have been probably a burden in little Zanesville when 1900 when he was born. They were 2 family names, but it turned out to be sort of prophetic because Tommy at the end of his life would split his time between Palm Desert, the city that he had created, and Malibu. So here he is with the long hair. That's not Irene, that's Tommy when he was a baby. But Tommy had this incredible imagination, and according to his daughter Duchess, he was just a dreamer. He had the most, she said that he would sit and just dream of something and then he would make it happen. And his daughter Kay said everything he did was special. So he would read, you know, adventure novels and romantic histories and just become those people. So on the left, you see one of the family photos that Duchess had. He read Lawrence of Arabia one summer, and that's his homemade turban and robe. On the back of the picture, it says Tommy the Sheik, or I'm sorry, Golden Sands the Sheik. One whole summer he was Huckleberry Finn and found this abandoned rowboat and spent the whole summer playing Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Another time he was obsessed with Tarzan, and that's who he became, and you had to call him Tarzan or else. After he graduated high school, he decided there was nothing really that he was interested in learning. So he took a correspondence course in drafting and surveying and engineering. And once he was old enough and could do it, he headed west to the great west, like so many young men do. There were oil boom towns happening, and so he would help lay these out and got great sort of background in engineering and drafting during those years. And in 1921, when he was about 21 years old, he ended up in Los Angeles. And because he was so tall and good looking, he was immediately discovered by someone from the Sam Goldwyn Studios, offered a film contract. And you see a little clipping in his papers. That's the Zanesville local paper saying Tomson's the latest addition to Hollywood Colony. When he got to LA, he got a job with the LA County Subdivisions Bureau and was helping lay out subdivisions. He got a side job selling people trees for in front of their houses. But he declined that studio contract because he really decided that he wanted to become a landscape architect, something he thought was sort of a gentleman's profession. He decided he would reinvent himself. He changed his name to the more professional sounding. He thought Charles G. Tomson. Took up smoking a pipe, took dance lessons, elocution lessons, and really tried to polish off those Zanesville hard edges and reinvent himself into Charles G. Tomson, the landscape architect. He bought what was really the only textbook at the time that was taught. It was Hubbard and Kimball's Introduction to the Study of Landscape Design. So with his typical drive and ambition, he really immersed himself in that book and decided that's what he was going to do. Around this time, he was at a USC sorority dance and sort of shy, he saw a girl across the room in a pink dress and told his friend, I'd really love to meet that girl. So the friend went over to another girl in the wrong pink dress, and that turned out to be Doris Henderson. They hit it off and they got married the next year. She was part of this really dynamic family, the Hendersons. These are the Henderson brothers. So you see here, we have Randall, Carl, Phil, and Cliff. Cliff really was the firecracker of the bunch, the one who really took all the energy out of the room, but they were all really interesting, dynamic people. And so through this association, Tommy was very fortunate because he got a lot of his work out of his association with this really dynamic family, which you'll see as we go forward. In 1924, they were married. They would go on to have two children. Kay was born in 1926, and there's little Duchess, who was born in 1938. The first job he got with a landscape architect was with Charles Gibbs Adams, a Southern California landscape architect, one of the first, university-trained landscape architects to set up an office in Southern California. He worked for Adams for about a year, mostly drafting the Kellogg estate in Pomona. He considered this a really important, experience and absorbed everything he could from Charles Gibbs Adams. His next job was at Greystone, the Doheny Jr. estate in Beverly Hills, which a huge house designed by Gordon Kaufman. Paul Thien was the landscape architect. It was really second only in grandeur at the time to the Hearst Castle being built. So this was a 3-year project, a huge project. Paul Thien, you may have read Nancy Carroll Carter. She wrote an article a couple of years ago, which was printed in Robin Carson's magazine. But he had come up at the San Diego Exposition in 1917-18. Really was a plantsman, obsessed with horticulture, but had the good sense when he became a landscape architect to hire young men just out of college who had that background that could help him achieve these things. And he had a career all through the 20s doing these magnificent estates. So at Greystone, though, Tommy was had an informal education when he met these two. So Alfred Keel had just graduated from Iowa State, and Thien hired him as the primary landscape designer on the project. And Fred Barlow had just graduated from UC Berkeley in 1926, the largest class ever to have graduated in landscape architecture. There were 6 students. And so they really, took Tommy under their wing and really wanted to help him succeed. And they were all young and getting started, and they all got along. In 1928, though, they decided, the Greystone estate was winding down. Fred Barlow went on to work with Catherine Bashford. Alfred Keel partnered with another landscape architect, Russell McCown, and they opened an office. And Tommy opened his own office at the Architects Building in downtown LA in 1928. And as you can imagine, with the stock market crash about to happen, it probably wasn't the best time. But here's an early project he got as his own, under his own landscape architecture office. So Cliff Henderson had just gotten a job as the director of the National Air Races. And so this is an event that would travel around the country, and Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, and would appear there'd be, planes doing these, people would come and watch the planes do races and loop-de-loos and all this sort of thing. So you see here Jean Harlow and Cliff at the National Air Races in LA, which came in 1928. So Tommy was hired to lay out the exhibition grounds and the parking for all of this. And after the National Air Races ended, he was retained to create this and to turn this into a permanent airport, which was Mines Field, which is now LAX. So he did the first iterations of that. Then the stock market crash hit. It pretty much decimated most landscape architects, closed their offices, and many took work with the National Park Service after Roosevelt came into office and started the New Deal. A lot of landscape architects and architects went to work for the Civilian Conservation Corps. But through Doris, one of her sorority sisters from USC, had married Richard Sunderleaf, and he had just gotten this huge project in Lake Oswego, just outside Portland, for the Carl Jansen estate. Carl Jansen, at the time, had a swimsuit company that was the leading swimsuit company. And so the family moved up to Portland for about a year and a half, and Tommy hit it off really well with Mr. Jansen. And he remembers they would drive around the island in Mr. Jansen's 16-cylinder Cadillac and just dream up different wonderful things to put on this island. They lowered the water of Lake Oswego so they could build this sort of two-door bridge, and there was an enormous estate and swimming pool and all sorts of things. But around 1932, he got a prime job back in Los Angeles and came back and opened an office in Hollywood. Through Cliff Henderson again, he got a job to do this estate for Donald Douglas, the aviation pioneer, and this was in Santa Monica. You'll start to see he had these renderings done all throughout the 30s, these really interesting overhead shots with, you can see the shadows of the trees and the layout of the grounds. And this still exists. And, I looked at it on Google Earth, and it still looks exactly like this, the same formal cutting garden and central fountain. And this project was published in 1933 in Architectural Digest. And so you see some of the pictures here. This is probably the only big Spanish colonial estate that he did, working on his own, but you see the Moorish inspired fountain and the tile work and the formal gardens. And so this really hit this off. And so he started doing more work for aviation people after this and started getting more work. But one day Duchess and Kay remembers this clearly. He came home one day and burst through the front door and started screaming, I got the job, and picked up his wife and spun her around. And the job was Santa Anita racetrack. And so this was a huge feather in his cap, someone barely getting started with all these established landscape architects, dying to get a job like this. And it was only really because Gordon Kaufman and he had hit it off so well at the Greystone project. And so Gordon Kaufman wanted Tommy for this job. The other, Mrs. Doheny too, hit it off with Tommy, and for the rest of their lives, anytime they bought a new house or their children bought a new house, Tommy Tomson did all the Doheny landscapes. So this was a multi-year project. He was on retainer at Santa Anita Racetrack until the 1970s. So he came up with sort of he and Gordon Kaufman went around the country looking at racetracks, getting ideas. So they came up with this sort of European-inspired formal paddock garden at the entry where you'd see the horses parade and you could choose which one you wanted to pick. And so you see it here, very manicured. He scoured Southern California for matching specimen trees and developed a relationship with Robert Hampshire, who had a nursery but specialized in the transporting and planting successfully of fine specimen trees. And so they went all over. They found these Brazilian peppers with this really interesting sort of splayed kind of horizontal form, hundreds of olive trees, 150-year-old Indian laurel fig. It was a wonderful botanic garden with specimen trees and flowers and crisp boxwood hedges. It opened Christmas Day, 1934. So the first season or two, they really spent all of their time on the formal paddock garden. And you see on the other side of the racetrack in the center, there's just a little bit of some maybe boxwood there. It's just an empty field. But the next 5 or 10 years, they really started filling that in. And every year was a new painting he would do with thousands and thousands of flowers. This is a 1937 Kodachrome that I found in his papers. Kodachrome really only was invented in 1936. And so this is the 1937 pattern that he has, and that's Tommy in foreground in silhouetted profile. But every year he would come up with some new painting. And so, people coming to see the racetrack had this beautiful thing to look at with the mountains in the distance too. Subsequent years, they added different, fountains and various things to lure people back. In the paddock gardens, it was, meant to be a destination. You would come here, spend the day, relax, and hopefully spend a lot of money on the horses. Here's his 1949-50 design for the infield. And then in the late 50s, this is a design he did to create some sort of an overflow, so people could spend the day out in the infield and not, spend the day inside in the bleachers. And it was really to make it a destination and something enjoyable. Come on, click. So this was a really important project that he got in 1935. Cliff Henderson decided they were going to do a national housing exposition because President Roosevelt's New Deal was starting to work, the FHA was formed, Federal Housing Authority, which was encouraging the building of new homes and giving affordable loans to people to either buy a new home or refurbish their existing home. And so Cliff got the idea to build this giant exhibition hall and have a national housing exhibition, have the leading architects and landscape architects at the time build these exhibition houses. And so, of course, Tommy got the job. And so this is his design for how that fair would look. There's an amphitheater shell in the background, beautifully landscaped plazas and fountains. When it actually was built, they scaled it down a bit, but this is the housing exposition. So these are houses with Catherine Bashford and Ralph Cornell landscapes. And at the end of the exposition, they were auctioned off, or the LA Times gave them to one lucky attendee. After that, Tommy came back in and really reworked the landscape for permanency. And this was a beloved Los Angeles institution where you would see, there were political rallies, female wrestling, roller derbies, you name it. Elvis played here. It burned down in the 80s. But for a long time, it was really a beloved Hollywood institution, LA institution. Really in the 30s, people remember Tommy Tomson most as the landscape architect to the stars. He did more Hollywood homes than any other landscape architect working. And really, people came to Santa Anita and saw his work. And oftentimes they would hire Tommy to design the landscape even before they had selected the architect that they wanted to work with. So you see here film star Tyrone Power and his wife, the French-born Annabella, and their pet goat in their Tommy Tomson landscape. One of the first Hollywood projects he got was the house of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Goldwyn. Goldwyn was the studio that had offered Tommy a screen test and a contract 10 or so years before. But this was a beautiful Hollywood Regency house with really extensive grounds. It was stayed in the Selznick family till about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. Now Taylor Swift has bought it and is actually restoring it. This is Tommy's design for the landscape for Mr. and Mrs. Charles Boyer. And this one was built, and if you look at it on Google Earth, this site plan looks remarkably the same even after 85 years. This is one of my favorite of his Hollywood projects. It's the residence of Mr. and Mrs. well, Walter Wanger, but it's Joan Bennett's house. Wallace Neff was the architect, this kind of French-inspired Hollywood Regency house in Holmby Hills. You can see in the back, Tommy, there was just an enormous lawn, and sort of to kind of make that a human scale, he created this frame of boxwood hedges. And then there would be seasonal color, so as far as the eye could see, tulips in the spring, geraniums in the summer, but just a beautifully, beautifully landscaped home. This is the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Basil Rathbone, and I have a typewritten sort of article that Tommy wrote probably in the 70s, where he gives little 2-sentence blurbs about the work that he did with Hollywood people. And for this project, he remembers that he would come over and discuss the landscape plans, and they offered him a Dubonnet cocktail and he would fall asleep directly. But this was a Werdnam and a Beckett design. Here's Tommy's beautiful landscape plans. The house actually wasn't built. So Mrs. Valentin Pereira was Grace Moore, the famous opera singer. And so she hired Paul Williams actually she hired Tommy Tomson first to design the landscape. And then Tommy recommended Paul Williams, the African-American architect. And so this was a home. She was famous for her gardening and her landscape. So she really wanted something where she could show off her landscape. But for whatever reason, after the house was built, pretty shortly thereafter, she sold it to Tyrone Power and his wife, Annabella. And so these are some shots from Hollywood magazines. But it's a beautiful sort of colonial-inspired Regency house with extensive grounds and citrus orchard, and the pool was big enough that you could ride a boat in it. Tommy's favorite actor was Robert Montgomery, and so he was thrilled to get this job. Another Plummer, Werdman, and Beckett project. Montgomery wanted a house that represented his East Coast roots, and so this is the house that Werdman and Beckett designed, and then Tommy landscaped the grounds, and this is the house that Elizabeth Montgomery of Bewitched grew up in. So here you see the pool with the pool pavilion. Another East Coast transplant who wanted a house that felt East Coast was Henry Fonda. And so this is the house. It was on the cover of House Beautiful. Sorry, the dog sees a lizard. And this is little Henry Fonda playing. So they built this sort of children's playhouse with this really interesting, probably one of the first biomorphic freeform pools. This is about 1938. And so we'll talk a little bit about Tommy really became known as someone who was really designing innovative swimming pools. The last Hollywood project I'll talk about is this, because it's a family legend. So Charles Chaplin was married to Paulette Goddard in the late 30s, and I think kind of to save their marriage, they had a house they wanted to expand, and Wallace Neff was the architect. So Paulette Goddard called Tommy up to the house and said, "Oh, Mr. Tomson, I interview all my prospective workmen in my bedroom." So he went in thinking it might be sort of a professional, have some sort of office attached, but no, it was a Hollywood star's black painted bedroom. And at some point, as the family told me, she went up to him and said, "Mr. Tomson, this lipstick does not wear off." So he got himself out of that situation. This is Tommy's own house, which was designed in 1938 by his friend the architect Arthur Hutchison. This was in Pacific Palisades, high above Santa Monica on Friend Street. So Tommy wanted an old California sort of house that looked like it had evolved over time. And so that's what he got. There were board and batten sections, pretty contemporary in detailing and the way it lived inside. But you see here the backyard, he planted his favorite tree, the California pepper, and it had, beautiful views overlooking this canyon in the back. This is a Christmas card they sent out in 1938 and an aerial photo showing it. So they had their property went all the way down the hill. And so you see at the bottom of the hill, Duchess and Kay had their horses. There were little orange and citrus orchards as you went down. And Tommy built a little hut, which was really his office that he worked out of for as long as they lived in this house. When Charles Boyer was redoing his house that Tommy was doing, he gave them these gates. And the little sort of lemon-scented gum eucalyptus you see on the left, one is named Kay and one is named Duchess. And though the house went down the hill in 1958 in a terrible landslide, you can see here there's Kay and Duchess. They're still clinging to the side of the hill. And the bottom picture is Duchess, who took me to see the site several years ago. So that's what's left of that house. This is Chateau Avion, which was the residence of Cliff Henderson, Tommy's brother-in-law. Again, it's Werdeman and Beckett. And this was this streamlined, modern mansion. This is what happens when you're a single man with a lot of money. So it had everything. Cliff wanted everything. He wanted tennis courts, badminton courts, every type of lawn game that you could come up with. This enormous, streamlined, modern mansion that had round beds in the bedrooms. He wanted later on, there was a swimming pool added, which you'll see, which was quite unique. But Tommy believed that in a modern house like this, a really strict formal garden made the most sense with, these curved lines and interesting detailing. So you can see here, it was on the hillside. And so over the years, as Cliff had the finances to do it, they would add to it. There were rose gardens in the front as you drove up to the house. A terraced place from which you could view either the badminton tournament that was going on or the tennis matches. And then in 1941, they built a pool pavilion with this interesting, another early biomorphic pool. We often say that it was the Donnell House in Northern California that is credited with having the first biomorphic pool with an interesting feature in the middle. But you see here in 1941, Tommy designed for Cliff this interesting biomorphic pool with a desert island in the middle with a pair of palm trees, his signature. During World War II, Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth rented the house. And according to Duchess, Rita's dogs destroyed the house. The beautiful interiors by Paul Frankel, and so Tommy had to sue to get them repaired. I want to spend a little bit of time on Union Station. It was another feather in his cap. This enormous project that he got starting around 1936. Parkinson and Parkinson were the architects. It's really considered the last grand railroad station built in the United States because, of course, after World War II, air travel became more common. You can see in this aerial how large it is. He, with Robert Hampshire, went all over Southern California. The perimeter is all old multi-trunk olive trees. And you can see the drawings for this are at the Getty, and you can see him working out the tree sort of patterns to work with the architecture, tall vertical palms in those voids where the windows aren't, and then magnolias in between. So here you see Hampshire, and he went and found where they could, they found really mature Mexican fan palms that were natural V-shaped palms, and where they couldn't find them, they made do by putting two in the same hole. But beautiful Moorish detail. It's a California mission inspired, California mission on steroids with this streamlined modern detail, kind of Spanish deco. But they spent a lot of time really thinking about how what the experience would be for people, coming and going. And Tommy said that he envisioned someone coming from Chicago or somewhere just awful in February. Um, so they pull in to where the trains land, they get out and they go into these subterranean tunnels and come into this beautiful, dark, cool Spanish deco interior, the hustle and bustle. And there's this choreography that's almost cinematic. And so you see the arrow that says out. They were directed not through the lobby, but out into this. And Tommy said, I wanted to give these people the experience of old California in one big moment. So you see here this, you're coming out through the tunnel and you're sort of entering this Garden of Eden. So he made sure that all the trees were evergreen, California peppers, palms. There were these parterres of boxwood with flowering color, birds of paradise, these really interesting light standards that you see with the clock tower, all kinds of flowering color with trumpet vines going up the walls, old Spanish detailing, but with beautiful multicolored Art Deco Spanish tile benches. Here is the site plan for the south patio. And this was meant to be sort of an outdoor reception room. So you would, meet your family when you picking you up from from wherever you're coming into Los Angeles. And he had planned a really big Moorish fountain for the center. Here's his drawing for that. But because of budget concerns, that was never built. But you can go there now and there's a beautiful brick sort of ghost of where it would have been. On the other side of the station is the north patio. This is completely enclosed. You can't enter it from outside. And this was meant to be an extension of the inside waiting room. And so if you're waiting for your train to go back to horrible frozen Chicago, this is your last moment to really bask in the glory of what Southern California was. And so he planned this just to be, a celebration of different colors and textures and scents. There's lemon scented gum, jacaranda. He has a hedge of avocado trees, a beautiful tiled fountain. You see here, always, splashing. Just a nice sort of relaxed patio, grass for kids if they want to play, an informal outdoor kind of ice cream parlor slash, diner, as opposed to the more, deluxe restaurants inside. And even on the outside, this is a magnolia tree alley, and look at these beautiful, enormous oil jars spilling over with flowers. So in the 1930s, the Paddock Pool Company developed the sort of concept of creating swimming pools by spraying gunite. Up to then, it was intensive hand labor. They were sort of cost prohibitive because of that. But they came up with a way to, using rebar and sprayed gunite, of making pools vastly more affordable. But with Tommy, they made pools that were vastly more interesting. So in 1940, in the San Fernando Valley, they came up with this Paddock Pools exhibit. There was one full-size pool completely equipped, and then 5 little teeny tiny pools complete with lights and diving boards and chrome bars to get in and out. And it was a big sensation. There were, all different styles from formal pools till you see on the bottom right, there's another one of Tommy's freeform pools that has big boulders embedded in the sides and kind of a woodland, tiny miniature woodland scene planted around it. But he became well known for his really innovative shapes and pools. This is the Royal Palms Hotel in Scottsdale, where he did a heart-shaped pool. For Thunderbird Dude Ranch in Rancho Mirage, which is now Thunderbird Country Club, he came up with this arrowhead-shaped pool, sort of harkening back to the Old West. This is one of my favorite. It's an oval pool, and what you don't see is it's an inverted dome, so it doesn't have straight sides down. It's really quite remarkable. This is the residence of Jimmy and Dodo Pendleton. This is one of my favorite of his projects. It's in Beverly Hills. It's just this jewel box. John Elgin Wolfe was the architect, one of his first projects, and Tommy Tomson was landscape architect. Now, Jimmy Pendleton was a New York antiques dealer and interior designer. He was gay, but he was married to Dodo Pendleton, who was very rich. And they bought this property and Tommy retained all the existing eucalyptus. There was an ancient sycamore which they kept, but this house is just, I can't tell you how enchanting it is. So from the street, you enter this sort of oval motor court. The house is kind of organized around this theme of ovals. So you enter the house into a little oval foyer, which you see here. And then there's an oval pool, and beyond that is the pool pavilion. So here's the motor court, a gravel motor court. The house is painted kind of a sober gray. It's French inspired kind of Regency modern house. Lady Mendel, Elsie de Wolfe, was Jimmy Pendleton's kind of mentor. And so she met with John Elgin Wolfe and Tommy Tomson, showed them pictures of little pavilions in Paris to use as inspiration. And so that's what you see here. One of the most remarkable things that they did was the fireplace, where you would expect to see a landscape painting or something. Instead, you see right through, and you can see the pool pavilion in the background. So when guests arrived, there'd be a big fire blazing in the living room and in the pool house beyond. So you'd see another fire out that way. This is Mrs. Pendleton at one of the fountains. This is Tommy's rendering for the rear garden of the house. And this is how it looked. Just a beautiful space. Mrs. Pendleton wanted purple flowers, and so there was every shade of purple imaginable. Film producer Robert Evans bought the house in the 60s and lived there until he died recently. And it's now being restored. And it was, sort of a dream to be able to go there last summer with some friends and tour it and spend the day with Robert Evans' butler and hear all the stories. So that one is a happy ending. It's going to be preserved. Park La Brea was the largest of the garden apartment communities in Los Angeles. It's Schultz and Weaver, the architects from New York, worked with Tommy Tomson on this. So here's the site plan, radial symmetry, a huge project. I think it's 175 acres. So Tommy, this is right as World War II was starting, developed plans for these little sort of wedge-shaped garden courts. And so he basically designed several of these garden courts, but then he had to go away. So Tommy Church came in and kind of supervised the installation of this. While Tommy was over in Maui during World War II, he was designing air landing strips for airplane in Hawaii. Here's one of the largest projects, one of the things he's most proud of, Palm Desert, about 12 miles outside of Palm Springs, hours more sun, lots more fun. It was meant to be, the first fully master planned community in the desert. Palm Springs had developed piecemeal. So Cliff Henderson says that it was his idea to do it. Randall Henderson says it was his idea to do it. So Luke Leuschner and Michelle McCune have been processing. The Historical Society of Palm Desert was the recipient of all of Cliff Henderson's papers, and not all of it's been processed. So they've spent the last year finding treasure after treasure. And so some of the things you'll see here is from there, but Luke has also been reading Randall Henderson's letters, which is shining a new light on how Palm Desert was developed. But here you see Cliff with Tommy. Tommy laid out all the streets and developed the master plan. You see here, this is what they were looking at. Duchess remembers driving, hearing all about this, driving there and being in the middle of nowhere and saying, well, they're crazy. But Tommy landscaped all the medians, and every house came equipped with twin palms, but beautiful wildflowers, something to delight the eye as you drove through and chose your home lot. The Shadow Mountain Club was the first thing built, and this was meant to be sort of the community's heart and would draw people in, and then hopefully they would buy a home site. But here you see Tommy's famous figure-8 pool. In the distance, there was a children's wading pool. There were tennis courts, a beautiful community building. And so here you see the proposed plan for that. And here's a rendering Tommy had done to show the Shadow Mountain Club and the lake with the desert island in the middle and how the home sites would relate to that. And here you see right after it was built. So it was built according to plan. So over the years, it grew and grew and grew. Randall Henderson had Tommy go with him to Tucson and to really some of the places. He was the publisher of Desert Magazine, and so he had really good ideas on how a master plan community, a new community, might evolve and have, you know, you're going to have people who are going to want to work there, and so you need housing for them. But Cliff didn't really want any part of that. He just wanted the Firestones and, you know, the famous people to come in and build houses. But the Shadow Mountain Lodge was a success, and it really did trigger people coming and experiencing it and wanting it, you know, to be their life. And so you see the dining patio. And so it was where here's Tommy and Doris dancing whenever they walked in. Uh, Artie and Todd would sing their favorite song, and there's Doris in the pool with her friends. So it became their social center too. But Tommy didn't want to live in Palm Desert. He found a jackrabbit homestead site and went down and paid his $5 or whatever it was for this. So the picture on the top left is the first house that he built. He came back a few weeks later and it was gone. The wind is so fierce up there that it had blown away. So he developed this new plan to build it out of sturdy railroad ties. So you see here with spider legs to hold it down. And so this is where the Tomson family really enjoyed Palm Desert. It had these big sliding glass doors, and so if you came to visit the Tomsons and they weren't there, the women would write a little note on the glass in lipstick. It became a tradition. In 1946, around the same time, Tommy did the landscape for the Frank Sinatra residence. E. Stewart Williams was the landscape architect, and his daughter told me that, you know, when he was developing this plan, would ask all the friends and relatives, I want to propose a piano-shaped pool for Frank. Do you think he's going to find that too corny? And they all thought, no, it'll be a great idea. So you see here the motor court, and it's out in the middle of the desert. But here's Tommy's piano-shaped pool, which Frank Sinatra loved. And just, you know, flowers. There were twin palms, which was his signature, and Sinatra lived here for several years. In the late 40s, he did hotel additions with Paul Williams. Here's the Beverly Hills Hotel. He was on a retainer with the Beverly Hills Hotel from the 30s to the 70s. And another one at the Ambassador Hotel, where Williams designed these sort of garden apartment townhouses adjacent to the old Ambassador Hotel. And then the Statler Hotel in LA. Here's his rendering for the interior pool area, and as it looks pretty much the same. But he was also designing large-scale factories too in the 50s. He told his family, I don't want to design anywhere that I have to plant petunias anymore. Another desert resort that he designed was Apple Valley Inn in 1948. So again, they started with a hotel, a resort that would draw people in, and there were home sites from which you could choose. And this is in the high desert, a different climate, but it grew. It's kind of seen its luster fade a bit, but the Apple Valley Inn's still there. This is in Apple Valley. Newt Bass was a Long Beach, very wealthy man, and he built this house on the top of the hill, hired Francisco Artigas, who was the leading modernist architect from Mexico City. And Tommy was hired to be the landscape architect. When I've talked to both Duchess and Kay, they said the minute Francisco, they called him Pancho, and Tommy met, they were soulmates. They loved each other. They were inseparable, even though they lived far away. Here you see them in Malibu at Tommy and Doris's second house after the house in Pacific Palisades went down the hill, and then at Pancho's house in Mexico City, and they're both dressed as charros. But they both had this romantic love for the past, and though they designed modernist homes and gardens for everyone else, their own houses were sort of romantic historicist designs. In 1960, Tommy unofficially retired, and so he and Doris went out around the world on a trip. Here they are on the camels with the pyramids. And he bought a large parcel above Palm Desert and wanted to build sort of a romantic Spanish-inspired house. And so this is his sort of first draft at it. And here's a note to Francisco saying, please make this very small, keep it compact, and hasta la vista. I want it to be a beautiful poncho house. And so here is Francisco Artigas's design for the house. And here it is. High above Palm Desert, you see there's Doris and Tommy in front of it. But he said, oh, I've retired to hard labor. And so he built much of this brick by himself or with friends. This was the aqueduct, the ruined aqueduct, which was a fountain. And so Doris and Tommy spent the remainder of their years very happy here, splitting their time between Malibu and Palm Desert. He had his own blacksmith shop where he would make things around the house or gifts for the family. And they really had some really happy years here. In 1974, they had their 50th wedding anniversary. In 1983, when Tommy had retired, he took up writing, and he wrote a romantic historical novel. And I have to, Jesuit Gold of Lower California, a tale of Don Fernando Xavier Rivera Moncada. And at this time, Doris had developed cancer. The daughters told me that towards the end, they went into the room with Dad, and they had just gotten the first shipment of books, and they said, Mom, Dad's book's here. And she had been in a coma practically for a few days, and she popped up and said, let's celebrate. I'm going to go get my party dress, and then faded back out. Tommy got cancer soon thereafter and was taken care of by friends, and here he is with Pancho. And so he died in 1986. So after he retired, this is his copy of Hubbard and Kimball's Introduction to the Study of Landscape Design, and here's how he summed it up. First opened office 1928, architect building 5th and Figueroa. Now 40 years later, Santa Anita, Union Depot, Park La Brea, 1,000 others. No fame, but a good game. So he died in 1986, and Doris died in 1983. And that is a conclusion. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Stephen. There are a couple of questions. There are a couple about all of the photos that you included. How many of those were from the personal archive that you're currently in possession of?
I would say, I don't know, maybe 15, 20%. Some are from archives like Historical Society of Palm Desert, but I would go when I was researching Fred Barlow and pull things from different archives. So I would also pull things if I saw something from Tommy. So UC Santa Barbara, UCLA. I'm also, just things that I've collected over the years. If something shows up on eBay, I'll buy it. That sort of thing.
Well, and I know that you mentioned very briefly before the lecture began when we were chatting that you have videos from early in his career, and somebody
So,
asked specifically about videos.
well, this is the remarkable thing that Luke and Rochelle found in these shipping containers that were in the parking lot of the Historical Society of Palm Desert. There were boxes of Kodachrome films that had never, hadn't seen the light of day, and thank God they survived in that heat. But they've sent them to get restored and digitized, and soon they'll be available. But I mean, it's just amazing to see Tommy Tomson and Doris, and she's in a beautiful hat and dress at Santa Anita in 1941. And there's film of Tommy walking around with those blueprints in Palm Desert, directing, doing the surveying and directing people, and as they watch the gunite being sprayed on that giant figure-8 pool. And to see, it's just, to see him move and in color and all these wonderful things. So, COVID stopped my research on Tommy, but at the same time, they were processing all this. And so I was able to go for the last year and see the progress. And it's just remarkable what they've done. And Luke, by the way, just turned 19 and is in his first year at UC Berkeley. And just amazing stuff that they're doing over there. So
when you say they, are the videos are they part of the formal archive that UC Santa Barbara is digitizing?
No,
okay.
That's at the Historical Society of Palm Desert.
I see. Got it.
And so they are benefiting from Luke having this passion, and Rochelle, who's a retired corporate archivist from the Gap, who's given her time for the last year.
That's amazing. So I
Yeah.
guess if people want to see those videos, they can contact the Historical Society.
I think, yeah, they're still being processed. They're still coming in. And so at some point in the near future, they will be made available. But I would say, you know, either join a mailing list for the Historical Society of Palm Desert or join, it's a good organization. And you'll get notified when those things happen.
Really neat. Thank you. I had a couple of questions. Would you would you say that Tommy Thompson had a style?
Well, perhaps. I mean, his style, he wouldn't have considered himself a modernist, but he did design, his landscapes were contemporary, but inspired by the romance of the past and the things that he saw. I think he wasn't formally trained, but had great aptitude and
Right.
soaked up whatever he could from, these trained landscape architects that he did work with. But he was a one-man show. He did all of that out of that little sort of hut behind his house. And he didn't have a secretary, he didn't have a staff. It was just Tommy doing all this um, for all those years. So that's pretty remarkable. I mean, if there was a big project, he might hire a draftsman for something, but it was just Tommy. Duchess worked in the office a little bit in the 50s, but to think of all that work that he did, just
Yeah.
at home.
I loved the little signature boxes that he would include in some of his drawings that you showed, a little airplane for the
Right.
airfield and was
Someone
it a
diving.
racehorse? Okay.
Uh-huh. And someone diving for the Jansen estate. It was a style that he had those done for about 10 years in the 30s. So they were probably big presentation boards, but I have photographic, I don't know what they are. They're kind of on thin paper. I don't know if they're early photostats or something, but they're pretty good detail.
Well, for somebody who didn't have, a really kind of a school that they were part of, he did have kind of a signature style.
It was, really glamorous um, settings in which you would live your life, really. Spaces, that would make you look good and where you could really enjoy your family and your friends adjacent, and related to the architecture of the house
Mhm. Right.
or resort or whatever it was.
It also seems to me that he had just really good fortune early in his career. I mean,
Serendipity from the beginning.
okay, I am glad that wasn't just me. I mean, he traveled out from Ohio and immediately got an offer for a film contract and then
Hmm.
decided to become a landscape architect and was working on the Greystone within what, a couple
With
of
a couple
years of that
years,
decision. Yeah.
and then got Santa Anita at the height of the Depression when everyone else was going to closing their offices. He was born with serendipity. He had a charmed life. If you're named Golden Sands, you've got to have
I guess,
something
yeah,
to,
that has to be.
account for that. But he made himself completely. Uh, he was just one of these people that was born different, but made himself,
Right.
decided to get out of Zanesville and really do something, and he did it. So
Somebody's asking if you have any of it, favorite landscapes of his.
I love the Pendleton house. That is
Oh, the one with the
the
bowl, the
the
upside down bowl
the
pool.
oval. It's
Okay.
a jewel box. It's just, I mean, I've thought about it so much and seen the photos, and I love John Elgin Wolfe, but when we walked through, and the house itself is just magnificent. And all that's happened at that house, all the Greta Garbo swam there. Everyone was at that house. Even, later on when Robert Evans was there. Um, that's one of my favorite. I love Palm Desert. I love the Shadow Mountain Club and that figure-8 pool. Unfortunately, it's been completely enclosed with condos and it doesn't look anything like that now. But the pool's still there. Duchess took me several years ago to swim there. And it's quite something. I love the Joan Bennett house. I don't know. I love everything he did. He's had a remarkable talent and just a fascinating person too. Really.
A good
So
subject for your book.
I hope to do a book. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's about 7:01 now, so I
Okay.
think we can safely wrap up. But I think there's take a moment and read through the comments before you log out because I think a lot of people are kind of sharing their own memories and
Oh,
just happiness over having seen these images. So
Good.
definitely absorb that. And thank you so
Okay.
much for this presentation.
Sure. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.